Months ago, I lost my job, my savings, and almost my daughter's trust. Today, with the last money I had, I bought this.
I used to run a whole bakery division. Now I'm the only baker, the only cashier, the only father she has left in this city. I can't fail her twice. I named it after her mother. Every loaf I bake for both of them. The one who's gone and the one still holding my hand. For the first time in a year, I wasn't just surviving. I was building something that was mine. Something no one could take from me again. Yo. That's it, on the house.
And then, on the best morning I'd had in a year, the man who destroyed my career walked through that door like it was any other day.
Opened. I want you to imagine losing everything in one single phone call, and suddenly the life you built for 15 years is gone. That's what happened to me. My name is Daniel. My name is Daniel Carter. Opened, and if this story moves you even a little, do me a favor before you keep watching. Hit that like button, subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to be heard by more than just algorithms. Opened. Now let me tell you what happened when the man who fired me walked back into my life 12 months later through the front door of a bakery he didn't know was mine. 15 months before that morning, opened, I was the regional operations director for Bennett Foods, one of the largest commercial bakery chains in the country. Opened, I had started as a 19-year-old dish boy in one of their factory kitchens and worked my way up over 17 years, night shifts, early mornings, missed birthdays. Opened, missed everything, until I virally 43 himself, Richard Bennett. I wasn't just an employee. I believed, foolishly, I could bet that I was family. I had a good salary, a modest house. Opened, a wife named Grace who taught 3rd grade at the local school. Opened, and a 6-year-old daughter named Emma who thought I hung the moon because I always brought home the mistake cookies. The ones that came out slightly burnt or misshapen and couldn't be sold. Then Grace got sick. Opened. It started as fatigue. She blamed on grading papers too late at night. Within 4 months, it was a form of doctors expected that moved faster than any of the doctors expected. I took leave. Opened. Not much because we needed the income, but I took what I could, sitting beside hospital instead of supply chain meetings, holding her hand instead of holding a coffee cup in another executive briefing. 6 weeks later, opened, she was gone, and I was a 35-year-old widower trying to explain death to a 7-year-old who kept asking when mommy was coming home from the hospital. Opened, I went back to work 11 days after the funeral because I didn't know what else to do with the silence in the house. I threw myself into the job the way some people throw themselves into anything that isn't grief. For a while, opened, it worked. Work just needed spreadsheets and schedules and shipment schedules and quarterly forecasts, and I gave it everything I had left. Then, 4 months after Grace passed, opened, Bennett Foods announced a restructuring initiative. 12 locations were being shut down to cut costs. Not failing locations, mind you, opened, but ones sitting on land to developers for triple the value of the bakeries themselves. I was the one who had to deliver the news. Bakers to 211 employees. Bakers who had worked there for 20 years. Opened, single mothers. A 71-year-old man named George Whitman who had been decorating wedding cakes since before I was born and had nowhere else to go at his age. I did my job. I delivered the news the way I was told to. Opened, in careful corporate language about difficult but necessary decisions. But 3 weeks later, in a boardroom overlooking the city, when Richard Bennett proposed shutting down a 13th location, the original Bennett family bakery, opened, the very first shop his own late father had opened 40 years earlier, purely because a developer had offered an obscene amount of money for the corner lot. Something in me broke. I stood up in that meeting, opened, in front of 11 other. It was wrong. I told him his father built that company on the idea that a bakery should be the heart of a neighborhood, not a line item to be liquidated. Opened, I told him he was becoming the kind of man his father went silent. Richard's face didn't move, didn't flush, didn't show a flicker of anger. That was the terrifying part. He simply looked at me. He simply looked at me and said, opened, Daniel, your grief has clouded your judgment. Clean out your desk. By 15 years of loyalty ended in 11 seconds, I'll be honest with you. I didn't fight it. I didn't have the strength to. I had just buried my widely opened. I had a daughter who cried every night asking where her mother was. And now I had no income and a severance package so small it felt like an insult up as generosity. I spent the next 2 months applying to every bakery chain opened, every food service company close to what I used to do. Word travels fast in small industries, and word was that I had publicly challenged leadership at Bennett Foods. Nobody wanted to touch me. My savings, opened, already thinned by medical bills that disappeared within 4 months. I sold my car. I sold Grace's jewelry piece by piece, opened, each sale feeling like another small betrayal I had to make to keep a roof over my daughter's head. We moved from our house into a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, and I remember sitting on the floor that first night, opened, because we hadn't afforded movers for the furniture yet, watching Emma fall asleep on a pile of blankets, and I have failed at the thing I promised her mother I keeping her fail at. But grief, I learned, opened, has a strange way of clarifying what actually matters. While filling out yet another job application that would likely something Grace used to say. I remembered something Grace used to say. Opened, she used to tease me that I complained about corporate bakery politics so much that I should just open my own little shop. Small, honest hours. Nothing fancy, she'd say. Just good bread and people who feel like family. Opened, I had a stable job, a pension, security. I didn't need to gamble on some romantic notion of a corner bakery, except now I had nothing left to lose. Opened, I found it by accident. A for sale sign on a shuttered storefront from new school. A building that had been an Italian bakery decades ago before sitting empty for 6 years. The windows were cracked. Opened, the sign above the door had realtor finally inside. There were dead pigeons finally let me in, were dead pigeons in the back room and mold creeping up one wall. It was a disaster. It was also, somehow, opened, exactly what Grace had described. I had 11 from sellings left to my name. The last of the money from selling her jewelry, our car, most of our furniture, and a small retirement account I cashed out at a painful penalty. Opened, the building almost nothing, for renovations, equipment, ingredients, or the small matter of feeding my daughter while I built a business from rubble. Everyone I told thought I had lost my mind. Opened, my own sister called me reckless, because for the first time since Grace died, something inside me, some ember I thought had gone out, felt like it was flickering back to life. Opened, I want you to understand what those next 4 months actually looked like, because it wasn't inspirational movie montage footage. It was exhausting, unglamorous, often humiliating work. Opened, I gutted the mold-covered walls myself with a crowbar I borrowed from a neighbor. I learned to lay tile from YouTube videos at midnight, while Emma slept on a folding cot in the back room. Opened, because we couldn't afford both rent on the apartment and the building's utilities, so we quietly moved in. Opened, I begged a restaurant supply liquidator for a payment plan on a second-hand oven that made a concerning grinding noise for the first 2 weeks. I called in every favor I had left from my old life. A former colleague named George Whitman, opened, the same 71-year-old wedding cake decorator I had once been forced to lay off, showed up one Saturday with his own tools and for 2 weeks $1 for 2 weeks of unpaid labor, saying simply, opened, you tried to save my job once. Let me help save yours. Emma became, without ever asking to be, my business partner. She was 8 now, sharper than any 8-year-old should have to be. Opened, and she took it upon herself to name the shop after her mother. Grace's corner one evening sitting cross-legged on a paint-splattered floor. Because it should be about her, not about being sad. About her being happy, opened, and baking and stuff. I painted the sign myself, badly, and neither of us cared that the lettering was crooked. We opened on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with exactly 4 items on the menu. Plain croissants, opened, cardamom rolls that had been Grace's grandmother's recipe, a simple sourdough loaf I used to bring home from the factory, except now every cookie was intentional, made with care, never a mistake at all. Opened, Our first day we had 6 customers. I remember every one of their faces because I was terrified nobody would come back. Lee opened, but something happened over the following weeks that I hadn't planned for and couldn't have manufactured. People started coming back. Not because we had marketing or a big budget, Lee opened, but because Emma would sit at a little table near the door doing her homework after school and greeting every customer by name within a week of meeting them. Lee opened because George Whitman's wedding cakes in the display case were unlike anything else in the neighborhood. Lee opened because the cardamom rolls tasted like someone's grandmother had made them with love instead of a factory conveyor belt, making them with margins in mind. A local food blogger posted about us. Lee opened about neighborhood bakeries making a comeback, featured us for 90 seconds. Slowly, painfully, month by month, Grace's Corner started to breathe. By the 10th month, we had 6 part-time staff. Lee opened, most of them people who, like George Whitman, understood exactly what it felt like to be discarded by companies that saw them as numbers rather than names. Lee opened, I hired a young single mother named Michelle who had been let go from a chain restaurant for taking too much time off when her son was hospitalized. Lee opened, I hired a 19-year-old named Tyler who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go and no one teaching him a trade. Without ever deciding to, I had built not just a bakery, Lee opened, but a small refuge for people who had been failed by the same kind of corporate machine that had failed me. It felt for the first time in 2 years like I was doing something that mattered beyond the profit and loss statement. Lee opened. It felt like something Grace would have been proud of. 12 months, almost to the day, after I had signed the papers on a moldy, pigeon-infested building, Lucu last $11,000. With my last 11th Lee opened, it was our best morning yet. We had a small line out the door for the first time. Mostly regulars, but a few new faces from a write-up in the city's food magazine that had come out that weekend. Lee opened, calling Grace's Corner the neighborhood's most quietly beloved bakery. I was behind the counter, flour on my hands, laughing with an elderly customer named Mrs. Whitman about her grandson's terrible driving. Lee opened. When the brass bell above the door rang and I glanced up out of habit, I nearly dropped it was holding. Richard Bennett stood in the doorway of my bakery. Older than I remembered, more gray in his hair. Lee opened, but unmistakably him, in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to, looking as out of place in my small, warm, flour-dusted shop as a shark in a garden pond. For a long moment, Lee opened. Neither of us said anything. The line of customers behind him kept chattering, oblivious, while the two of us stood frozen, 12 months and an entire universe of loss compressed into the space between the door and the counter. Lee opened. Daniel, his voice quieter than I remembered it being in that boardroom. I set the tray down carefully, mostly to give my hand something to do besides shake. Most people don't, I said. Lee opened. That was rather the point of starting over somewhere new. He looked around the shop, at the mismatched vintage chairs I'd found at estate sales, at Emma's crayon drawings taped near the register. Lee opened, at George Whitman decorating a small cake in the corner, and something in his expression shifted in a way I hadn't expected. Not the cold, unreadable calm Not the cold, unreadable calm from that boardroom. Lee opened, something closer to discomfort. In the food magazine, I didn't put it together that the address was. He stopped himself. I wasn't looking for you. I wasn't looking for you, if that's what you're thinking. Lee opened. I was here for the coffee. My driver recommended it. It would have been easy in that moment to let a year of resentment come pouring out of me. Lee opened. God knows I had rehearsed versions of this conversation in my head more times than I'd like to admit, standing over a mixing bowl at 4 a.m., imagining exactly what I would say if I ever saw him again. Lee opened, but something about seeing him standing membered, slightly more human, made the anger in my chest feel less urgent than it had. For months. Sit down. I told him instead. Lee opened, gesturing to an empty table near the window. We hesitated, clearly unsure whether this was a trap, a trick, or simple hospitality. He sat. I brought him a cardamom roll and a coffee, and for a few minutes, Lee opened. Neither of us spoke. Emma, homed in from the back room's bush and stopped short when she saw a stranger in an expensive suit sitting alone at her mother's bakery. "Who's that?" Lee opened. She whispered to me at the counter. "Someone I used to work for," I told her honestly, because I've never believed in lying to my daughter, even about complicated things. Lee opened. She studied Richard for a long moment with the unflinching Drexmalmalt's paper napkin beside his plate, decorated with a crayon tour dilated with a crayon drawing of a sun she'd made that morning. Lee opened. "That's for you," she said simply, and walked away before he could respond. I watched something crack quietly behind his composed expression. "She's kind," he said when I came to refill his coffee. "Like her mother must have been." Lee opened. He said, more sharply than I intended. "You're right," he said. "I don't asked you. I never asked. In 15 years, I'm what showed up on Hemp about your family beyond what showed up on an insurance form." Lee opened. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. I should have said something at the time. I didn't know how, and then too much time went by, and it felt easier to say nothing at all. I didn't respond right away. Lee opened. "Some silences need to be allowed to sit." Richard continued, "Not to excuse what I did, but because I think you deserve to know it." Lee opened. "If only so you can hate me with accurate information instead of assumptions." He told me then about his own father, the man who had built the original Bennett bakeroom, the one Richard had nearly sold before I stood up in that boardroom. Lee opened. His father had died 2 years before I was fired, and Richard had spent those 2 years drowning in a version of grief that, instead of softening him, had hardened him into someone obsessed with growth, expansion. Lee opened. Numbers, as if enough success could somehow fill the hole his father's death had left. "I turned the company into a machine," he admitted, "because a machine doesn't grieve." Lee opened. "A machine doesn't feel guilty about closing 13 locations. I fired you because you reminded me of my father's voice, telling me I was becoming someone he wouldn't recognize." Lee opened. It was easier to remove the reminder than to listen to it. I sat down across from him then because my legs needed to, honestly. "Do you know what happened after you fired me?" I asked. And I told him all of it. Lee opened. Grace's jewelry sold piece by piece. The folding cot in the back room, the mold and the crowbar and the $11,000. I was simply to make him suffer. I was simply, for the first time, Lee opened, saying it all out loud moment it began. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I closed the original location 6 weeks after I fired you," he finally said. Lee opened. "The developer's offer fell through. Some zoning issue, and by the time it was resolved, I couldn't bring myself to sign the papers. I don't fully understand why, even now." Lee opened. "I think some part of me kept hearing what you said in that meeting." He looked around the bakery again. "This is what my father's shop looked like. Not the building. The feeling." Lee opened. I'd forgotten what it felt like to walk into a bakery that felt like this instead of a factory with a bakery-shaped logo on the door. I won't pretend that one conversation erased a year of hardship. Lee opened, or that I walked away feeling warmly toward the man who had upended in 11 seconds. Grief and grudges don't dissolve that easily. But I don't think they should. But something did shift that morning. Not forgiveness exactly. Lee opened, but the beginning of understanding, which is sometimes the only honest place forgiveness can start from. Richard came back the following week, and the week after that. Not as the CEO of Bennett Foods, Lee opened, but simply as a customer who sat at the same table by the window, usually with a folder of paperwork he rarely opened. Lee opened, watching the neighborhood move through my small shop with something that looked almost like hunger. Hunger for shareholder life he had traded away for shareholder meetings and expansion targets. 2 months later, when Lee opened, he made me an offer I genuinely did not expect: not to buy Grace's corner, not to fold it into his empire, but to invest quietly as a silent part. Lee opened, in opening a second location in the very neighborhood where the original Bennett family bakery had once stood, the one he'd nearly sold, the one he couldn't bring himself to close. He wanted no control, no branding. Lee opened, no say in the recipe said, "I'd like to be part of building something honest again. Even in a small way, even if I don't deserve to be." I thought about it for 3 weeks before I said yes, And even then, Lee opened, the 71-year-old cake decorator Richard's own company had once discarded, would run that second location as an equal partner, not an employee. Richard agreed without hesitation. Lee opened, that was 6 months ago. Grace's Corner now has 2 locations, 11 employees, most of whom were once told by some larger company that they weren't worth keeping. Emma still does her homework at the little table by the door. Lee opened, still greets every customer by name. Still hands out crepe drawings at Treasures Aporzo. George Whitman decorates wedding cakes again. This time with his name on the door instead of buried in a corporate org chart. Lee opened, and Richard, the man who fired me in 11 seconds after 15 years of loyalty, sits at the same table by the window most Tuesday mornings. Quieter than he used to be, occasionally still awkward, Lee opened, but present in a way he never was during all those years I worked for him. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't stood up in that boardroom, if I hadn't lost everything. Lee opened, if I hadn't been forced to remember what my wife once said about a small bakery and good bread and people who feel like family. Lee opened, I think about how the worst 11 seconds of my life became the reason the best year of my life was even possible. I don't say any of this to suggest that losing your job, your savings, Lee opened, or someone you love is some kind of hidden blessing. It isn't, and I would trade every square foot of this bakery to have Grace back for one more morning. Lee opened, but I've learned that sometimes the things that break us completely are also the only things capable of clearing enough space for something truer to grow. If this story meant something to you, Lee opened, if it reminded you that starting over is never really starting from nothing, it's starting from everything you learned the first time, then I hope you'll stay close to this channel. There are more stories like mine here, real ones, Lee opened, about people who lost everything and built something better from